time, so let's start on time. Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone joining us today. My name is Paulo Tostes dos Santos, and I'm part of the technical team of the United Nations Regional Hub for Big Data in Brazil, hosted by IBGE. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this new webinar in our series of Sustainable Development Indicators. Throughout this series of events, we have been exploring how new data and global metrics help us to measure the progress toward a more sustainable future. So, along this path, it's essential to recognize that we cannot build true sustainable development indicators without integrating the communities that protect the planet in the most biodiverse ecosystems. Therefore, today we will take a fundamental step toward understanding those monitoring and data process from a perspective of rights, ethics, and community governance. Uh, Today's webinar is titled From Land and Waters to Code and Cloud. So in an era where environmental decision making is increasingly driven by algorithms, remote sensing, big data, ensure that indigenous people have control of their own data, it's inseparable from their rights to the land, life, and the future. Today, we will analyze how to view digital ecosystem not as something abstract, but as a space to deeply connect the sovereignty and respect for rights of the indigenous peoples. Without further explanation, it's a true honor and privilege to introduce to our speaker today, Dr. Lydia Jennings. I will tell you a little bit about her outstanding professional background. Um, Dr. Lydia Jennings is a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe. She's an assistant professor and faculty fellow in the Department of Environmental Studies of the Dartmouth College. In addition, she's the director of the Southern Soils Research Collaborative and co-founder of the Indigenous Data Alliance. So with this brief introduction, we give her a very warm welcome, and I will pass the floor to our speaker, Dr. Lydia Jennings. Please, good morning, Dr. Lydia.
Thank you so much. I'm going to first just greet you all in my language, Solo Shinshinabo and Apoliria. Again, as I'm a citizen of the Pascua Yaqui tribe, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. I'm really excited to talk about what is Indigenous data and how, with the considerations of Indigenous peoples as land stewards of the past and present, I really want to take these considerations into place today, how we can think about specifically biodiversity data, something that Brazil is quite rich in, and how Indigenous peoples broadly across the world are stewarding their ecosystems that we study that hold this biodiversity, and how we can help support as researchers, but also as a citizen of a community, how to continue to support Indigenous data expertise in our ecosystems. So this really takes me first to thinking, and how do we define what is Indigenous data? How does that perhaps compare to environmental data, and how we think about that? So there we go. So when we talk about Indigenous data, it's data or information in any format that impacts Indigenous peoples, our nations, our communities at both the collective and individual levels. That can be knowledge in any format, but it's generated by Indigenous peoples as well as our governments, the private sector, and other institutions on and about Indigenous peoples' territories and homelands. That can comprise information, specimens, and knowledge about the environment, the lands, the skies, the resources, and our more than human relations. But also information about Indigenous peoples as both individuals. And so I think about a lot of that in terms of administrative or legal, health data, commercial data, but also information and knowledge about Indigenous peoples as collectives. And so I think this really applies to our conversation here about biodiversity and ecology data. And that can include traditional and cultural information, oral histories, ancestral and clan knowledge, cultural sites, stories, and belonging. And so really in thinking about this here, I think we're really thinking a lot about this data about our resources, our more than human kins, our environments, and how Indigenous people have long been data experts and data stewards. And broadly, that today scientists are recognizing that Indigenous peoples are experts of our homelands and our territories. I think this is particularly important in Brazil, where 13% of the land mass is reserved lands, and it lies in the Amazon, and just 1.5% of it is outside. But even though we have roughly 500 million Brazilian indigenous peoples who live outside of the Amazonian. And so there are long cultural practices, and I don't have to talk to you all because I know many of you are much more experts in understanding the important biodiversity work that indigenous people are doing in stewarding indigenous data and recognizing the cultural practices with that. And I bring this up that indigenous communities are stewarding these important data ecosystems because it's now being recognized more and more that indigenous peoples outside of indigenous communities, that indigenous peoples are stewards of ecological data. So here's just a recent paper that came out in Nature Biodiversity, where they're recognizing these types of data that indigenous people have always held as really important to how we understand biodiversity and our human and nature relationships over long time scales. And so people are looking at oral and linguistic evidence, archaeological written materials, paleoarchives, spatial information. And it just really highlights how much of indigenous data has gone through the ultimate peer review process of being peer reviewed across generations and generations and generations. And so when I think about the types of indigenous knowledge and the types of indigenous data that has been collected and stewarded, it might not always be in the binary format that we see today, right? And here are just a couple of examples that kind of come from my homelands, and maybe that will help others think about some of the indigenous types of data formats and data repositories that exist within Brazil itself. And so this is called an autumn calendar stick, and it's on a saguaro rib, a type of cactus in our area, but it basically records the seasonality and the time that is happening in our area. This is a Lakota winter count. And so recording what was caught when, what season, but on an animal hide, right? And so it really tells you important information about biodiversity of specific foods sources. This is from down in Peru, and this is a Kepa system, right? With the knots are recording important times and dates, locations with different colors. And importantly, this also teaches about data protocols where it was presented to a community when you come in. So again, really important ways of making sure that data is publicly available by sharing it, presenting it when you are coming into a new community. This is also a beautiful example of a Pawnee star map. So importantly, recognizing how there was an understanding of information, even of our cosmology, of our sky systems at a time before telescopes that was recorded to tell really important seasonal stories. And then lastly, this is something that's here in the Northeast where I work at is a wampum belt. And wampum belts narrate really important histories about creation stories of the Haudenosaunee. They empower the person holding it as a representative of their people. And also identify specific political responsibilities. So recognizing how each of these types of data repositories also had certain applications and responsibility with the data representation. And I think about that a lot today in our work in biodiversity, and what are the responsibilities that we might have as data stewards and data actors. I also want to just kind of take it back into the large ecosystems in which we work in. It's widely recognized that there are more than 274 terabytes of Earth observations being collected, generated, gathered, and processed every day. All of this, whether recognized or not, is on indigenous lands using metals for those data centers or data tools being extracted from indigenous lands using indigenous waters to cool down those data systems. But it's rarely connected back to indigenous stewards or recognized as indigenous data relations. And I really want to highlight, it goes everything from the microbial scale up to the geospatial scale, right? Using automated and semi-automated technologies. And pausing for a second, why does this matter? It's because we want science that is grounded in the place-based expertise of the indigenous experts who have stewarded these ecosystems. But how much are indigenous people actually consulted or engaged in around this data expertise that we know, the widely reported statistic that indigenous peoples are responsible for 80% of global biodiversity. How much of that expertise is actually translated into how we ask questions and how we steward questions? And so this is a study done by a colleague of mine, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, and they looked at 20 years of biodiversity data in in North America. And what they found was an interesting spectrum of going from everywhere from no engagement. So researchers are accessing indigenous communities, their soil systems, their water systems with no engagement, all the way to the process that is indigenous centered and led and has indigenous values. Communities are part of the authority within the research process. And what they found is that when you think about this spectrum of engagement, that 87% of studies had basically no engagement, or sometimes community members were asked for opinions or consulted. And so what I want to highlight is that when we think about that 80% of global biodiversity that centers around indigenous expertise of stewarding the most biodiverse ecosystems, the majority of our studies are actually missing out on that expertise, right? And as we think about, as researchers thinking about the return of investment of our science, we're actually not doing our science well to be able to engage with those communities. But what was powerful, excuse me, was that there was a handful of studies that engaged in a different way, that was more collaborative, that was collegial, that was indigenous led. And we think that these are really powerful ways to think about how we do biodiversity monitoring, ecology research that really centers the expertise of the communities from which this information comes from. So as we think about that, this Indigenous research governance, the question is, how do we better engage in that? And that's where this conversation that's broadly exploding over the last 10 years of Indigenous data sovereignty. And it is the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, the ownership, and application of their own data. It goes beyond community-based participatory research because it recognizes the inherent rights that Indigenous people have to govern their ecosystems, their lands, their resources. But it also recognizes each community has their own traditions, roles, and responsibilities to use the information that's often held in community. It also recognizes human rights international frameworks, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the World Health Organization's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health, other such international policies, right? It also recognizes that knowledge belongs to the collective and is fundamental to who Indigenous peoples are. And this especially becomes important when we think about biodiversity data. So Indigenous data sovereignty can be quite broad, and there are a set of frameworks that have been developed to really help relocate authority over data back to Indigenous peoples. And that is specifically the CARE principles. Now, if we're in person, I would ask how many people have heard of this. They were established in 2019 to really shift the focus of data governance from consultative to values-based relationships, and have been widely recognized as enriching the discussion of collective rights of data for other populations as well. So there are 4 co-principles within the CARE principles. The first is thinking about collective benefit. So how are the data and outputs that are being designed function in ways that enable Indigenous people to derive benefit from the data? So, right, thinking and asking the questions, how is it beneficial to the community? Are they using Indigenous classification systems? Are community experts compensated and part of the process? Another is thing with authority to control. And this is actually a piece of the conversation that makes people most uncomfortable. But right, it's the question of, are Indigenous people's rights and interest in Indigenous data, such as biodiversity data, recognized, and are their authority to control in the data respected? So this is where we think about establishing principles or protocols for research development, data management, and publication. It's thinking about how is the data that we're generating oriented around community consent protocols. Are communities having access to data and the publications? How is information being returned back to the community from which it comes from? Are they having a peer review process with community? That's something that's often missing. It's also something that, as researchers, what are our responsibilities? All of those who are working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how those data are used to support Indigenous people's self-determination. How is research that we're doing creating and expanding opportunities for capacity sharing? How are we using Indigenous languages? How is this process consent-driven, inclusive, and relevant to community needs? And then lastly, the ethical piece. How are Indigenous communities' rights and well-beings the primary concern at all stages of the data ecosystem centered? And so are they using Indigenous ethical frameworks? Does it apply to community protocols for data infrastructure, metadata, and secondary use? And so you might be looking at this and being like, well, these are really great for research-based field-based type of work, but how does that translate out into the larger data ecosystem? And so I want to bring up the FAIR principles. And if you're any kind of scientist who's working in data repositories, and no doubt many of you in the audience have heard of the FAIR principles, right? It's how do we make our information findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, right? And this is something that most scientists are trained in, especially working in large data repositories. And so the FAIR principles really help to seek increased data sharing, which is great. And it really highlights components of provenance and thinking about machine actionability. So today in our AI-centered world, FAIR principles are really vital because they make the metadata more accessible, more findable, right? But they often don't think about the considerations of communities themselves. And this is something where sometimes this tension has arose. And so the CARE principles are often seen as a really vital and complementary piece of considerations for non-tribal data creators, stewards, and data users, right? They set forth these important considerations for non-tribal data creators to help guide the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in our data governance and increase Indigenous communities' access to data and decrease digital colonization. So they really shift the focus of data governance from consultant to value-based relationships. And I think really important is that they are complementary. People often put them as a tension, but they're complementary because the FAIR principles are not only important to everyone, but they're especially important for Indigenous communities who want to be able to find information about their homelands. And we see more and more non-Indigenous folks see the CARE principles as the only part of the data ecosystem that really brings back the people and purpose orientation. So I really want to highlight that these are complementary protocols. And I really want to highlight how many communities around the world are bringing in or developing their own system of CARE principles. And so this is just kind of a global map that we have seen of emerging or complementary principles being developed. So in the US, we have the US Indigenous Data Governance Principles that really derive from the CARE principles and part of the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. In Canada, we see the First Nations principles being developed. Similarly, some work being done in Inuit communities. Sami in Europe are really developing more of these data principles. A lot of work happening in Australia and New Zealand. They're really the ones who kind of got this going, this work groundbreaking. And then also the Asian frameworks being developed as well. I also really want to highlight, as we think about these regional principles, that there are individual groups who have their own community protocols. And we are often reminded as we work in the CARE principles that CARE directs people home, directs researchers home for those who work with Indigenous data, home to the community in which it pertains. And so again, there is a scalability piece that is really important about this. And as we've already discussed, Brazil has such a diversity of Indigenous peoples, each with their own cultural protocols around data sharing. So the question is, how do we translate these practices into digital infrastructures? I also just want to highlight that not only are there regional principles, but there are also global principles. And so we're seeing these come up more and more in conversations with the Convention of Global Biodiversity, the UN and the UNESCO, and the open science principles. And again, there is authority to governance within this, but the CARE principles do lie within the open science mandates, right? And it's just thinking, we want to have data as open as possible, but closed as necessary when it pertains to culturally sensitive information for Indigenous peoples. And this is continuing to evolve and evolve. I also really want to highlight that when we think about these principles of data governance, these again are kind of a spectrum of the types of principles that are put forward. Many of the mainstream principles are very data oriented, which is great, but they're not people oriented. And we actually see some of these more Indigenous led frameworks bring back that people and purpose orientation to the data itself. And so again, as we think about how Indigenous people are stewarding 80% of global biodiversity, we really need to highlight these people and purpose orientation so that we don't ensure that communities are being put at risk for data extraction, but also for all of the pieces that lie within that. In my case, in my community, I got into this work because of mining and how data principles were setting up certain areas of our community to be more extracted from without our consent, without us knowing. And this is why I believe this work is so important. And this is a particularly interesting conversation in today's data environment where we have AI and biodiversity monitoring being more and more important than ever, where when we're using tools um, such as species classification, and you can use AI to help identify those, right? And it goes into these large ecosystems, or it can go into even collecting samples of ecological models and environmental DNA. But a lot of this is done without in more of a helicopter research response, where people are collecting data, often not even talking to Indigenous communities, and then using these large models to create visualizations and assertions about communities without the communities even knowing or fact checking it. And so the idea of bringing in the care principles is, how do we move away from this helicopter science practices to one that really follows more of a data sovereignty workflow? And so thinking about it also has benefits for better science, because we're reducing time and efforts of the researchers in the classification process by working with Indigenous communities. We're interacting with data that could help restore relationality for communities to the landscapes. We're designing work for the collective benefit of communities. And we're also thinking about cloud versus non-cloud and access and running models more locally. These are some of the pieces that are actually really valuable to making AI and biodiversity monitoring more community oriented, and recognizing it's an important tool, but one that needs some additional steps to be more relational to the practices in which we're doing. And there's a lot of challenges within that, because the question that continues to remain is who owns or controls Indigenous biodiversity monitoring data. There are huge amounts of collections about diversity that are held in repositories or other online databases outside of the community, and often they're missing proper provenance information about the communities. And we also know that Indigenous communities are largely not the legal rights holders of the data. It might be open access, but communities aren't always able to find where that data is at. There are also huge issues of mistakes in the metadata that make it really hard to find and control, but also there are a lot of questions about responsibility and ownership of data. And we see this particularly happening the larger and larger and the more global data repositories become. And then today, as we have more researchers than ever collecting data and samples from Indigenous lands, the question is, how do we bring back that relationality and that stewardship, and how do communities find information about their homelands so they can make data-informed decisions? So let's come together and think about, how do we address these challenges? How do we not end up like Spider-Man, all pointing to each other and pointing the blame, but instead think about how to work together to resolve them? So one of the basic steps is how communities are developing research policies and protocols for external projects. We kind of talk about this as the Indigenous Data Governance Bundle, medicine bundle. And so you see here a spectrum, everything from very limited enforcement, but quite informal practices, to those becoming more formal with clear enforceability. And so we see things from policies and protocols, where communities are putting forth protocols with university research partnerships or with data repositories being developed. You also see something that has a bit more formal policy language, such as a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, where they're building relationships and tools that can set out clear expectations with how parties behave with each other. And that can be quite specific. You're also seeing more agreements and contracts. So thinking about intellectual property, for example, of how data is going to be used and for how long. And then lastly, and this is more the localized element, that tribal nations are specifically putting out code, policy, legislation, which is very clear enforceability and defining the legal rights and obligations. So one of the examples that we see here in the United States, this is with the Wabanaki tribe, a tribe in Maine, an agreement that they have established, the U.S. National Park Service Agreement, around gathering traditional medicines, specifically sweetgrass. They also use visual sovereignty signage to highlight what are those responsibilities. And so they include information about why and what protocol, and also how people can and cannot engage with them, and gathering permits. They had actually used research permits to be able to collect information about this particularly culturally significant plant. They have also developed intellectual property around using Indigenous cultural information, establishing training and staff for visitors, permissions about using images, as well as ownership of research data and a permit system. So really important protocols and tools moving forward about how people engage with the collection of culturally significant plant species. Another step that's being established, and probably one that's most of interest here in this big data hub, is how people are using tools to enrich the metadata. So local context is a really important company that is being an important tool to help us to enrich the metadata itself and to really put this enrichment into action. And so they use a variety of tools called traditional knowledge label tools, biocultural tools, and notices from this local context hub. And these labels and notices were developed in partnership with Indigenous communities globally to enhance Indigenous data governance and establish the conditions for the sharing and reuse of Indigenous knowledges and intellectual property in digital spaces. And how this works is you can actually put in these data tags in all phases of the data lifecycle. So everything from collection to sequencing to outputs to then even data reuse in larger repository collections. And so the goal is to create law, policy, and ethics, as well as infrastructure that can support Indigenous rights and Indigenous data throughout the data life cycle. And it strengthens these rights by making changes, even minimal at first, across data actors and research institutions and repositories and publishing and even funding. So I think this is a really important tool that can be easily implemented and people can follow. And again, so that communities can find their data wherever it might be. And I just really want to underscore that it's important that researchers disclose Indigenous collections and data. We have a responsibility to do so, and these data label tools are a really important tool in doing so. We see some current projects really happening with environmental DNA, even just the process of open to collaborate notice, which means that maybe they right now don't identify that they have certain amounts of Indigenous data, but they're putting it out here with a very streamlined process of how to contact the researchers from the communities themselves to make sure that they can find their data and how to continue to build those collaborations. And so they're putting space in the digital infrastructure itself to be able to add in the future layers that specific cultural protocols of the data. That might include traditional names, that might include the types of identifications that tribal nations want. That might include who is the point of contact for establishing these. Also, what's really cool is that they actually have an automated system that'll message the tribal monitoring, tribal specialists and tribal monitors so that they can, again, be contacted anytime there's data that pertains to their community. One other part that the European Reference Genome Atlas is doing is even just adding spaces in their data manifest to make room for Indigenous knowledges, understanding that it might be important culturally. They need to have a point of contact. They might need ethics permits, right? So they've added all of these different layers and categorizations in there to make space in the digital infrastructure, which we find many folks are having a really hard time even just adding in those specific categories. And so these are a few examples that are being established. The next, I think, is just recognizing and reclaiming relationships with long-term research sites. So a project we have here in North America, United States, is we have lots of long-term ecological research sites. Many are Indigenous lands. So this is actually a map overlaying the long-term ecological sites, which is these different categorizations here on the bottom with Indigenous lands using the Native Lands program. And again, you can see what native lands are on there. So how can we work with these different field stations to better establish protocols with Indigenous communities? And so one of the things that we did is we had a committee come together to think about what are the recommendations Earth scientists need in open Earth system science to start establishing Indigenous data governance at each stage of the data life cycle and specimen life cycle. So thinking about collection, storage, publication, citation, and reuse. And so we've kind of established some recommendations. I'm not going to spend too long because I'm just seeing time here, but thinking about everything from assessment and communication and building relationships and aligning data use policy with new perspectives that the communities put forth at each of those field sites. And then thinking about how is the site access and data collection here in North America, here in the United States. Many tribes were prohibited from entering their traditional homelands when national parks were created. So thinking, and that also applied to when research stations were created. So now, how do we establish protocols and formalization agreements so that communities can have access to their sites, but they're also involved in the data collection process. And also some names of these park sites were also using really harmful and colonial names references. And then we think about the specimen data management. So again, using these local context tools to enrich that metadata, but also making sure we're thinking about how we identify the traditional homelands of the different nations that pertain to these long-term sites. And then I think the last part is really recognizing that these are data relations. So how do we amend our citation guidelines to recognize the homelands from which they come? How do we support education across earth sciences? And how do we recognize that as this data gets reused, communities need to be aware of where it gets reused? Now, this might seem like a lot of pieces, and this is going to take time. We recognize that, but I do want to highlight just some important examples. This is one in the French Polynesia, Moorea. So this has been studied. It is the most studied field site in the world. They've been collecting data since the 16th century, respectively. And importantly, data has not been returned to communities it pertains to help them make data-informed decisions about their ecosystems. And so a project which I'll speak a bit more out in the future, or in future slides, is beginning to implement these metadata labels to enrich that process so that communities can find data that pertains to their homeland. The last part I'm just going to kind of highlight here before I go into one last example is that also Indigenous communities are starting to create their own technologies that really center Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance in their infrastructure. So we see replacements to things like ArcGIS and Esri stories, one being that is Terra stories that really centers Indigenous data sovereignty. We also see Niwin, this other type of technology that is really here to center data sovereignty in each of these. So communities are also creating their own technologies. And so this even can be applied into digital infrastructure. Again, using these traditional knowledge labels to really be able to assign the value, cultural value to different culturally significant plant species. So as we kind of move ahead and think about not only the technology pieces, but these are nice examples, but what ways can Indigenous data sovereignty be really operationalized within this global biodiversity data repositories? And so I want to share this last part here about some of the work that I'm doing with the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is the largest global biodiversity repository. They have over 3 billion data occurrences. I'm really interested in this because I'm a soil scientist. And importantly, they have many member states. Brazil is part of this conversation and part of this work, many different types of publishing outputs as well. And as we think about the data points that have been collected in all these nations and how much they have not been connected back to the people from which they come, let's just take a look at a map of that, right? So this is actually looking at these 3 billion data occurrences that GBIF currently has. All of these data occurrences that exist, there currently is no way of identifying Indigenous data in the occurrence records. There's no provenance data to help make visible the Indigenous data. There's no way for communities to find the data that pertains to them so that they can make their own data-informed decisions, right? And so we know in recent years, there's been a recognition that Indigenous people steward this large amount of biodiversity. And by data repositories, and no doubt part of why I'm here, there's been a recognized need to better support and amplify Indigenous communities and their relationality to data. And so in 2024, GBIF established an Indigenous task force on Indigenous data governance. And so I chair that committee, but we have representation from South Africa, Brazil, Australia, Norway, New Zealand, and Sweden. It's the first of its kind within any global biodiversity infrastructure. It brings Indigenous leadership into the biodiversity data governance, and it builds on the FAIR principles by embedding care into the process. And so as we were asked to how can we use this task force to strengthen Indigenous voices and ethical use of data, we really understood that we need to understand the landscape and what are the concerns and needs that people have. And so we did this through a survey, which I'll discuss in a second, but also working with GBIF experts to best define data sharing practices. How can we bring the care principles into the process, and how can we establish some technical pilot projects? And then lastly, how do we share with the larger GBIF community to really help make them a leader in these biodiversity conversations, right? And so our goal continues to be creating a network of Indigenous data governance practitioners and educate and collectively troubleshoot. Again, so much of this work is only 10 years old, so there's a lot of space for expansion, but we want to position GBIF to lead by example in the implementation of Indigenous data governance. So we did conduct a survey. I want to talk about some of the preliminary findings because no doubt you all might have some of the same questions. First and foremost, what we asked, what are people's role in the GBIF environment? We see that a lot of people are data publishers, a lot of people are data users, and we don't see a lot of Indigenous community representation, only about 12%. So that helps us really think about where do we target our first efforts in this work. We also looked at what regions are represented, and unsurprisingly, a lot of the people who responded to this really come either from Europe or from Latin America and the Caribbean, and as well as North America. So those are kind of our three primary areas. And the majority of people do not identify as Indigenous peoples in this work. Then we asked about Indigenous data sovereignty and how familiar people were with it. And the majority of people were familiar, somewhat familiar with this work. Same thing with Indigenous data governance. People were familiar, somewhat familiar. And the care principles was like half and half. Half people have heard of it. Half people were like, I'm not really sure what this is and familiar. And importantly, as we explore this, most people have heard of Indigenous data governance, but they don't know how to implement it. And no doubt many of you in the audience are also asking those questions. So then we looked at the needs people have. A lot of people want training, they want case studies and examples, they want technical guidance, and clear expectations and policies, right? So again, people want to know how to use this. And also people want funding. How are we going to fund it? How are we going to fund this? What kind of guidance or expectations do I have? I think people really want to also have an understanding of policies and expectations from nation states, as well as who are people who are doing this right. And so this is a piece that we're continuing to develop, this kind of resource hub. But as we also identified, well, what are your concerns? They have needs, but also what are your concerns? Many said it's not relevant to my work. And this is something, as I'm here with you all, I really want to push back on. Everyone, as I kind of said in the beginning, is working on Indigenous lands or Indigenous waters, and many often don't see that they're working with Indigenous data, right? So this really highlighted a need that we need to have better education about what is Indigenous data and why it's relevant to highlight these relationality pieces. And then also, people having kind of follow-up questions of why are special considerations for Indigenous people needed, Indigenous people's data needed, and realizing how tools like the Darwin Core can help provide technical framework and examples to follow. So that for us as a task force tells us that's one of the first places that we want to target our work. Other people were, again, having the same question of what are the right balance between open data and Indigenous data governance? And how do we do that without compromising scientific discovery and innovations? So that again tells us we have some places of how we help share the tools and target that to really show examples where it enhances the science. And then I think this is a really important question that's still being explored, but what are the implications of increased legal and ethical uncertainty in downstream data use? This is where, utilizing our network of Indigenous lawyers can really help us understand those implications downstream. When we looked at the biggest challenges, I think many of you might also have these questions. What are the institutional understanding of Indigenous data sovereignty? What are the guidances and how there's a lack of guidances? So, I think that these are all really great information for us to target our next steps. When we think about those next steps, we're in the first year, going to the second. And so we see that people are really interested in learning and engaging with Indigenous data sovereignty and governance and the care principles, but they're afraid to make mistakes and they need guidance, and we can do that. We also recognize we have a lot of vital gaps in member nation states, but as we go into our second year, the first things that we're working on are doing training materials. and working on this legal governance piece, we're also establishing community infrastructure and translation works groups, as well as another work group that's working specifically with Indigenous communities. What I think one of the most important parts of this survey was that multiple people highlighted how amplifying Indigenous voices to the GBIF network would help in widening Indigenous voices, but also making the science better. And so in recognizing some of our pilot studies that we've done, if you want to learn more, please take our survey or sign up. I'm happy to discuss this more with you. This is part of the Data Vivos conference last October. But one of the things I want to highlight is, since this survey has come out, we actually started to do some pilot projects. And so going back to that French Polynesia study site, we looked at the GBIF data repository, and we started to work with local context to do a demo case study. And what's really cool is we were able to look at some of these records from New Zealand and from French Polynesia, and putting in some of these local context labels into the metadata itself. And so what that translates to is that for the first time ever, we were able to make visible over 300,000 data occurrences that have these local context labels and notices embedded in them that make it a clear identification of Indigenous data in the GBIF occurrences. So I just really want to highlight how this is game-changing for those communities. The first time ever, they're able to see where their data relations are at, who's stewarding them, what's collecting them, and how do they get access to it. And again, how does that help inform their stewardship responsibilities? And so this is game-changing, but this work continues in all stages of the data lifecycle. So some of the new things that we have coming up, we're developing a set of guidelines for the publishing of Indigenous data. And it's a community-led effort with over 150 scholars, Indigenous publishers, editors, and metadata experts from around the world, to really think about how we highlight Indigenous data in the publishing process. So just to think about some of the pieces that it's already being done, we're doing dual language publishing. So making sure that it's available to multiple communities and languages, that we can see Indigenous data in Indigenous languages, right? This is coming from Taylor and Francis, who's been a really hands on deck with working with this. Another piece is that people are asking, well, the care principles are great, but how do you actually know if they're effective? So one of the things that we're doing is developing the care data maturity model. This is led by Riley Titanfong, and it works with a variety of entities, especially in data repositories, who are seeking tools to aid in the implementation of the care principles and in their respective settings. And so one thing we see is that funders need tools to monitor if care is working and if it has care compliance. And this is really inspired by the FAIR data maturity model, but now applying it for the care principles. And then the last piece I'll just kind of highlight here is that we have just in this last year, November 14th, the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, has established the first ever Indigenous data standard. And now it is a recommended practice and has since been published. A really great example of like defining what is Indigenous data and what are the standards that we have in using Indigenous data. So, for many of here who are in colleges and biodiversity experts, I always think about, why are the engineers beating us to the punch when we know that we're using Indigenous data constantly, right? And I want to highlight that I joke about this, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the amount of hard work that goes into creating the standards. This took 5.5 years to develop, but it is the first ever and is one that is informing a variety of other standards being created. And I will say, we have a task force happening right now of developing an environmental genomics standard specifically for Indigenous peoples. So those are things that are coming up and ongoing. I just want to highlight, as we think about this, that this work takes time and intentionality. And so I've given you a lot of overview and probably a lot of information of across spectrums of where this is working at. But what I think is important is that this highlights that relationships across individuals and collectives are needed to initiate care for data governance. And so many of you here might be individual data users or research teams. We're working with professional societies such as American Geophysical Union, with many data and research institutions, publishers and journals, funding agencies, governmental bodies, and international bodies. And I want to highlight and underscore that we all have a role and responsibility with it to create intergenerational shifts in our practices. and really highlight, as the GBIF data set has shown us, it took us 500 years to get here in collecting data on Indigenous communities. It's not going to happen in a single year, but this is generational work to change what our data practices look like that better support and amplify Indigenous data and Indigenous peoples. And so, in closing thoughts, we've again underscored that Indigenous people have always been data experts of their ecosystems, and biodiversity monitoring needs to center this expertise to not only be great for Indigenous peoples, but also to have better science. And GBIF, who I work with a lot, has the potential to lead in this Indigenous data governance, but it's taking time, investment, and technical expertise. And we are ongoing establishing more and more protocols and practices and case study examples to really get this work amplified. But I also want to just really underscore that we're just getting started. So if you want to learn more, please reach out to us. I'm really honored to be here and engage in a bit of conversation as we finish. But please feel free to reach out. I'd love to chat more with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lydia Jennings, for this presentation. Um, we are in sort of a time constraint over here, and so we are not open for general questions at this time. If you have any questions, we can truly forward to Dr. Lydia. Just send me an email, and we will pass on to her. Okay. So thank you
I
once.
can take like 5 minutes of questions if that's okay. I don't know if that's over time for you all, but
Oh, are you okay with 5 minutes, Dr. Lydia?
5 minutes is fine. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. So we have 5 minutes in case anything has a question. Please just go ahead, send that at the chat. Yeah. And while people is thinking about their questions, Dr. Lydia, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Uh, for a community that wants to start protecting the information, uh, what would you be your advice on the first step to organize their own data governance?
Yeah. I think one of the first steps, if the community is to write their own data governance protocols, I think that's a really important piece. And we see that operating within nation states can have various pieces of recognition status, but by communities having their own data governance protocol, that's really important, because when researchers want to work with them, they have that protocol established to share with them and work within institutional frameworks. I would say that most university research frameworks or internal review board processes are kind of the baseline. So by communities creating their own protocols, it really sets the priority of what data they want to, what kind of expectations they can put forward in terms of things like timelines, things like authorship, things like compensation. I think that's actually the most powerful piece, is when communities establish that. Obviously, there's varying degrees of what that looks like, and it's up to communities to decide. But also then, as we start getting up the data ecosystems and going into data repositories, there are a lot of pieces that are still being fine-tuned of how do we think about things like cross-referencing.
Thank you, Dr. Lydia. And so that brings me another question, which is what do you think for non-indigenous scientists or academics working in the region? How can we conduct research or collect data without falling into the information extractivism somehow?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also just building relationships with communities, and understanding what our community expectations. I, for example, am now no longer in my own homelands. I'm in New England. And so the first process that I am doing, which is like on the other side of the United States, right? The process I'm doing is like building up those relationships and seeing what kind of process communities want to work with me and why they should work with me. Data governance is really fundamental to how I begin my research practices, and it's like well established in the relationships I build that I'm not going to publish anything or move forward in anything until we have a data governance protocol established between us. And so it's kind of a contract between us as researchers and community, and then also one that I have with my university and myself as my projects. And so I think that is a hard part because it takes time. But it is, I think, really essential to how we engage in research. I see a question.
on
How
the
can we
chat.
highlight Oops, yeah. How can we highlight Indigenous peoples and understand how much they contribute by giving us data and information? Do you think language is the biggest factor in highlighting you or the isolation of Indigenous people? I do think language is a really big challenging factor, especially when you think about how many of these studies are down in the global north. Um, this is why I think having researchers in community are really vital. Whether, again, like I don't work in my own homeland, so I'm working in partnership with other folks. Um, and a lot of this GBIF work has been one of the things I've noticed in my leadership capacity is that the majority of our leadership in the GBIF committee task force is from global north, and that's something that has to change because we have so much of the biodiversity data in Latin America and South America that there are different considerations and different protocols. And I actually think this is a really great time for Latin America and South America to be leading, especially with geopolitical situations, right? So I think that language is a really important piece of this and how communities are developing their own cultural protocols to establishing this. I think language is a really big factor. Sorry, I got kind of highlighted there. And I also think that Indigenous peoples are setting the expectations of what questions they want to be explored. And so as a soil scientist, I might be really interested in the soil biodiversity, but communities are actually really interested in the soil health of this in this place. And they tell me where to highlight and to sample. And I think that can be really hard as we get into the biodiversity monitoring. But again, communities are experts in their ecosystems and their questions are really vital to informing how we engage and move forward. Okay, I probably should head out. Okay, let me just answer one more question. Do you think it could be beneficial to implement databases of traditional knowledge? Um, Databases of traditional knowledge is an interesting question. I don't, I talk to Indigenous communities, they talk about elders being databases of traditional knowledge. Some communities don't want some things published, right? So I think it is a process and negotiation of like what are information that communities want to share and have stored in data repositories. I think this is part of what makes this work hard is it's a process of relationship building and navigating what people want to be shared and not shared. And there's a lot of information that has been taken from communities and shared in databases that communities aren't comfortable with. And so the first like fundamental step of a lot of this work is how do you reconcile past harms that researchers have done through extractive means, and how do you start to rebuild what that looks like? And I think this is a hard question when we talk about big data sets, but there are communities that are doing it. And I think, the French Polynesia example is a really great one because how do people start to rebuild their relationships with traditional knowledge when they don't even know where it's at? And I think a lot about the samples that are collected during colonial expeditions that now sit in museums or data repositories, and communities don't even know how to start targeting what data to return or how to steward it because they don't know where it's at. So when I think about our conversation with big data sets, the first piece is making sure communities know what's there and what's not there. The next question then becomes maybe it is a future conversation to have a traditional knowledge database. But I think there is so much knowledge in other places that we just are still trying to find. This is where I was really excited to have this conversation with you all because Brazil is a place that has been heavily extracted in terms of data. And this is the opportunity to, within your science practices today, to think about how we expand and bring back that Indigenous locality. And this is the collaborators I have on the GBIF committee from Brazil are really excited about this work. And also their communities are already doing really amazing pieces. And so highlighting that piece of things. Okay, I probably should really go. These are such great questions. And I'm so appreciative of your time and the questions. And I would love to continue to engage in this work. So, and with you all. So please feel free to send an email. Oh my God, there's so many great questions in here about traditional knowledge labels and digital library in India and Brazil. You don't have a database like that. Oh, okay, I better go. But thank you so much for your time and your attention and great questions. And please, let's continue to be in conversation.
Thank you once again, Dr. Janice, for providing us with such relevant and profound necessary seminar. It's been truly enriching space to understand that building true sustainability indicators requires rethinking data sovereignty. So we look forward to continue and explore those initiatives in the future. I would like also to say a thank you for Juan Canipa, which is our researcher, which made the contact with Dr. Jennings and made this webinar possible today. So thank you, Juan. We are closing. For the
Thank you.
audience, we invite you to look at the regional hub web pages, so you'll be able to see the next webinars or programs that we will be releasing in the future. All right. Excellent day for all of you. Thank you for being here once again.